Good evening and welcome to Dark Hour Paranormal. Tonight I present a recent interview I was so cordially invited to attend by Penny Bradley, founder and host of Nacht Waffen Pilot. Penny has been conducting interviews for quite some time, and I recommend you take a look at her channel to find her extensive body of work. Now, Penny and I very quickly dove into the subject of the Montauk project and the town of Montauk as an enigma, with her own experiences to share as well. I hope you enjoy this fascinating discussion as much as I was privileged to be a part of the Nacht Waffen Pilot channel.
He's working on a documentary regarding Montauk, and I think that's more related to the later history of Montauk. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Penny. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I know we talked for a while before you scheduled, and we talked for a little bit today before I started recording. I went to your channel and watched some of your stuff, so I have a decent idea of what you talk about. And guys, he's a real researcher with some experiences, and he's not one of the fly-by-nights. So when his documentary comes out, watch it. So
I appreciate that very much. I'll make a very stark differentiation between the first documentary that I put out last year called The Montauk Enigma and what I'm attempting to work on this August. The Montauk Enigma was more of a personal journey into Montauk. I had been with a certain history with the Montauk project itself for quite some time. And this was sort of a culmination, an apex where I was meeting a certain part of myself energetically in this location. There were some very interesting experiences I had prior to being there and then leaving that I'd be more than happy to share with you. But what I'm focusing on with this second presentation is a more comprehensive documentary on the survivors of the Montauk project, because there are a myriad of them, even though I think Preston Nichols had mentioned maybe 1% had survived. Given the vast numbers that we have been told, that's still reaching into the hundreds. So with this in mind, we're all very familiar with Al Bielek, Duncan Cameron, and Preston Nichols' interpretation of the Montauk Project, how it was related to the Philadelphia experiment and so forth. But there are many other people who have peripheral and direct experience with the project itself, and the narrative may spin a little bit differently. It might parallel some of the things the other guys had said, but not only would I like to document this end of the experience, I'd like to dive into the whole reason we're going through this now, why we're remembering in such detail some of the aspects that were played with in projects like the Montauk Project, because believe me, Montauk was only a jump off point. There were many other sister projects, and there are still some in effect today that relate to what was done in Montauk. I wanted to approach this from an angle of healing. So, my personal experience, what I'm doing with Montauk now is essentially the cleanup work. And there are many of us doing this. And those who weren't directly involved with the project physically may have some sort of interdimensional work to do, because there were many dimensions that were traversed, created, or otherwise manipulated by this experiment and others that were attached to it that still need that attention. And we do this sometimes in our dreaming state. We'll go into these different dimensions and do whatever work we can sort of surmise in way of that sort of healing. But to come back into this reality, to know that we're still carrying certain things from those projects, whether it be guilt, whether it be some sort of cultivated attribute that lies in the realms of esoterics, or something even more fantastic. How is this affecting us to the point where we've gone through the trauma, and now we're standing at the precipice of being expected to go into the healing aspect of it, which again may not be any easier for some people, because you have to revisit that trauma again. But how is this affecting the survivors that went through this, and how are they turning it into something positive and strengthening, self-empowering in their life today? And again, I just don't think this is an aspect that's been focused on enough. It's always about the negative things that happen there, which of course do have their relevance. But at the same time, we need to sort of turn the focus a little bit on what we're really doing, still keeping this project as stark as it is in our consciousness.
Okay. What I've found with my people, friends, alliances, is that the actual survivors tend to be pushed aside and not believed. And so they have a compulsion to share the more negative aspects. It's a cry of, this happened to me. And I've been public since 2016, but I think the most important single thing that I have done during this entire 6 years was the special that I did with Montauk survivors on Memorial Day weekend. It ended up being 4 hours, and we had a person who did not know they were at Montauk told that they were, and it was a rather shocking experience for him that he's still processing. But we were blessed that a CIA archivist came in unexpectedly and verified that each of these people were actually there. And based on the files that she had uploaded to the CIA's computer. So this was a major breakthrough for all of these people who kept being told that they were delusional. This was an important thing. And before you can start to heal, you have to be heard. And that's a step that a lot of people are wanting to skip. They don't want to hear what happened to you. They just want you to heal from it.
That's an impossibility, in my opinion, unless you have some sort of superpower that allows you to supersede any trauma that you've gone through. Yes, you have to revisit this in the, wave of that particular end of healing. I think began with Al Balick, Duncan, and Preston. Some others followed along, people like Stuart Swerdlow, Andrew Basiago, Andy Pero, there are many names within that first generation that all they really needed to do, or at least the mission, was to get their voice out there as boisterous as possible. And they were going to highlight some of the negative aspects because it was going to get people's attention. Not only that, it was, purportedly the truth. So, I can't in my right mind rationalize why somebody like Preston Nichols would sit there and tell us in certain detail how these children were used in the project itself, as horrific as it is, and then incriminate himself in the process, saying, well, I was part of this. Listen, one of the things that people don't seem to understand, and I want to put this out there to make it very, very clear, is that, there are folks thinking that, people get into the Montauk project or they watch Stranger Things and they jump on the bandwagon, somehow thinking that they were part of this. Listen, you don't want to be a part of this project. When I realized that I had connection to it, I was very, very forlorn, melancholy to a certain degree, embarrassed until I started to kind of go back into my history and again, as you say, look at certain things and work in that healing sense, get my voice out there. And in doing that, even just talking about it, there was a healing that came for me. But unfortunately, because the implications of this type of work were so vast, we may spend a good portion of our lifetime, healing and learning different aspects of what had gone on in our involvement.
Yeah, that's understandable. There was so much done there. People they either think about the atrocities that were done to the kids and never think about what the kids were then used for, or they skip over the atrocities to just what the program was trying to do. And I never understood how Al Bielek could go on record saying there were 300,000 boys that were killed there and not be charged with murder. I never understood how Preston Nichols could admit to homosexual rape and not be charged with pedophilia. I never understood this. You know, this made no sense at all because the perps actually admitted to the crimes. I mean, anybody else, they would have been in prison.
You know, one way that this may have really gone, obviously the result is the same, depending on what we sort of guess here, is that there's no substantial physical evidence that their story actually happened the way that they say it happened. In fact, if you look into it in certain details, there are some holes. But this can be explained in certain ways too, because there were memories that were coming very non-linearly, and they had to kind of put things together the best way they could. I mean, there's a whole explanation behind that. But getting back to the atrocities, again, I mean, I started wondering too when I, heard Preston talk. I mean, again, he's incriminating himself and others that were, possibly part of this project. How was he not questioned further? But again, it all lies in this nebulous nature that is the Montauk project, and that nobody's supposed to really know about it. So if authority figures did come for someone like Preston, that might be an acknowledgement that there was some substance behind what he was saying. And again, the implications, if they were trying to just bury this thing, all puns intended, because most of it happened underground, if they were just trying to bury this, then they might just sweep it under the rug. Fact of the matter remains, it more than likely was a great multitude of people that were considered to be those handlers. And, nobody wants to have their name in that bucket. And Preston maybe knew a few, or maybe he didn't. But either way, if they went after one, next thing you know, they might be going after others. So there's a chain reaction that happens here, a domino effect in prosecuting somebody who has a story like this, or even looking into it to say, whether it's valid or not. I mean, again, the whole Montauk story is just so enigmatic that I think that they chose not to pursue it in a certain sense, if they were even watching at all.
That's been one of the things that, because I was doing peer counseling for years until the CIA broke my shoulder. At that point, I was in too much pain to handle other people's issues at all. But these people kept coming to me, and some of them, a significant number of them, had also been at Montauk, along with the other things they were bringing to me. Montauk seemed to be like a common thread. And so I started paying attention to who said what made sense in rational terms, and what sounded like they had had dreams. That's one of the things in this community that I have issues with, is people who have dreams but never claim them as memories. They don't.
Yes.
That bothers me in a lot of ways. It's like, what are they? Well, I don't want to find out. Then don't waste my time with it. That's how I feel. But I started paying attention to the people who were taking responsibility for their memories. These are the people that I thought were credible, even if they weren't the right age group, because I know from my experience that these folks have time travel. So you don't have to have been born the right time frame to still have been there, because they have time travel. And some of these programs,
that's correct.
Some of these programs are in time bubbles. So they just plop you in, leave you for a long time, plop you out, put you back where they got you, and nobody else is the wiser, except that you are suddenly screwed up big time. And there's no rational explanation for it except these memories that if you don't take credit for them being memories, then you have no idea why you're screwed up.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think there's a lot there, yes.
there are thousands of people out there that are like that. So
100%. And, again, a lot of them have difficulty facing this sort of thing. I mean, as a result of certain aspects that you're talking about, the life that they live, the physical life they live, is certainly a challenge because they're inundated with certain memories or emotions or empathies that they simply aren't understanding the intensity of why it's in their life or, why certain things are happening. A lot of these folks don't feel like they have control over their life. And I think that is reminiscent of, so it's reminiscent from on the project. It's reflective of that trauma. And again, God, we are that onion, right? And you heard this in many different terms. I heard it in acting school. They had mentioned, when you peel the layers off an onion, you're going to get to the very core eventually, but on the way, you're going to cry. That's just the way that it goes. And I think for Montauk survivors or Black Project survivors in general, because I've spoken to people from MK Ultra as well, just to highlight another one that's actually been corroborated by Senate hearings and so forth. There's a big apology people are aware of.
President
there's this
apologized to us. So in, I think it was 1985. So for the MK people, I don't know what the name of my program was, but I was taken at age 4, and at age.
Now, let me ask you very quickly. You're taken at age 4. Were you indoctrinated by a family member, or were you taken in a different way? Out of curiosity, how did that happen for you?
For me, I was 4. I have no memories from before that, none. And I was picked up by several men in green fatigues and driven cross country from Central California to Langley, Virginia in a Jeep, Korean War era type Jeep. And by the time we left California, there were 3 or 4 kids in the back seat. There were a couple of men in green fatigues in the front. We drove in tunnels. We followed Route 66. It took us close to a week to get to Langley, and from that point, I was in a basement in one of the buildings there, and it was before the CIA building was there. And per the CIA archivist, I was an asset of the OSS. And I was there for 5 years, except for the 6 months that they took me to Montauk, which was part of that time. And everything nasty that can happen to a 4-year-old girl happened to me. And they had a regeneration tank that would bring me back from the dead. So one of the things that I learned was that death was not an option. So I had to do what I was told, the way I was told, when I was told, and letting myself be killed would not relieve me of that duty.
So many people watch, again, to reference Stranger Things, and, they kind of get the precursory idea that, this was built on something legendary. There's some sort of myth behind it, the whisper Montauk through the trees. The truth of the matter is that, Duffer Brothers used a lot of what happened in Montauk and illustrated it in their own way. But the concept is absolutely real. I mean, what we see Seven go through in the beginning of the first season. I mean, I even had difficulty watching that, to be honest with you. It was triggering certain things in me. Of course, I forced myself to go through it, because, we need to be on that level now. But I mean, this, again, it's not exclusive to Montauk, but it may have been developed.
It's not exclusive to Montauk. I had talked about it before Stranger Things came out, and it's documented that I talked about it before then. And when Stranger Things came out, I would sit there and I would just literally shake for hours afterwards. After each episode, it took me effort, because where I was kept, it was white tile, white walls, white uniforms, white clothing, and we were in white cotton pajamas, and I had my room that was just the size of my child-sized cot, and everything was white, and I was basically in solitary confinement when I wasn't being put through some process. And everything that can happen to a 4-year-old girl happened to me. Even as far as being nailed inside a hole in the wall and left to suffocate. They got real creative.
It's part of that deprogramming that we use the word so lightly. But I mean, Penny, as you're mentioning, they used every extreme that you could possibly imagine within that to deprogram somebody and break them. Obviously the idea being that they knew that they could extract certain consciousness out of a body or an auric field. They could hold that in an electronic manner, we'll say. And when they reconstruct that and put it back together, they reinsert it into the body as if it were mechanical. And from that point on, the idea was to be able to have the full control and, guide that one that they've programmed this way in whatever fashion they choose. The thing about this particular project is that it actually affected every single person and every single being on this planet. And again, as we've mentioned, many different dimensions beyond, but, for the sake of conversation, it can't necessarily be quantified at the moment, but, we'll maybe find some more evidence of that as we go forward. Long story short, they played with reality, and they discovered it during that time, such a way to play with reality that they actually erased certain timelines going back, because they would revisit something, and, as they did this, they found out that it would lessen in intensity, and next thing you know, the frequency blipped out. They couldn't find it anymore. So the speculation is that they actually erased or, smudged out that timeline by going over it so many times, wherein now we have a different reality than where we were originally supposed to be going. And, there may be some evidence of that in the explosion of certain consciousness that the general public has displayed, especially within the last 100 years, I'll say, more towards more recent years, last 50 years, definitely we've seen this influx. Back in the 1800s, people were very interested in spirituality. And, you had mediums coming to parties, and you had these, black magic circles and so forth. But a lot of it was done for entertainment, although there was some substantial research behind it at the time. It wasn't necessarily something people explored and said, well, this is separate from our ideology or belief system. They looked at it as a parlor trick. Well, through the 20th century here, they've obviously solidified that it's not a parlor trick. It's an intrinsic natural part of ourselves to be able to understand these mechanisms. And yet they exploited it at the same time because, in my opinion, nobody was monitoring that. There were no consequences immediately for their actions for the ones who were involved. In the long term, certainly. But even those who were involved in the project, guiding this along administratively, had no idea where certain things were going. In fact, there were many people who were considered to be handlers who didn't understand the full scope of what their job entailed, although they were doing it on certain timelines without their conscious knowledge. This is where things start to really break apart because, again, the Montauk project itself was not linear. That is something people have a very difficult time putting their head around. And, until we get the right verbiage and language to understand that and convey it, we're going to be in the dark to some degree.
There was a lot of effort put into creating a time bubble at Montauk. And most of the experiments later on were done inside the time bubble. But a lot of their work was towards consolidating power for the CIA. And there were a lot of missions done to take out this individual or that individual. Where when I was there,
yes,
we were working on the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is the idea that you can accidentally step on some creature that you don't even notice and that it will change how everything works. Now, what they tested and found was that every species, every time era, there are key individuals who do affect evolution, who do affect the timeline, but that the majority are fillers. They matter in their own lives, but they don't matter to history. Now, that's an important distinction to make because there are a lot of people who are calling them non-player entities and think that they're disposable, but they're not, because they do affect your main characters simply by being there. Now, I personally have real issues with anybody that says individuals are disposable. I have never heard of a genocide that I approved of. And I'm hearing a lot of people talking like it would be a good idea, and they're doing so in esoteric terminology where it sounds oh so spiritual, but murder is still murder. And I think people need to stop and think. But when I was there, what they had me doing was going back to a general store in the 1880s somewhere in the western United States and stealing apples off of the store's porch. I wasn't supposed to get caught, but they were testing to see what effect the actual taking the apple would do. And so this was the stage they were at in 1961. Now, 20 years later, they're going back and shooting the store owner. So you're having all kinds of things so that they can own that property because so-and-so is going to keep it from them. And so they go back in time and they kill the prior owner. And they do things like that. And they went through, the South actually won the Civil War. And they went back and changed it to the North winning because the North would stand a better chance against the Germans in World War I and World War II. And they did all kinds of things trying to make sure that Germany did not win World War II. And even so, the Germans in Antarctica still won. And they still escaped into space, which was what they were trying to prevent. That's what 90% of their stuff was about, was keeping the Germans on Earth.
And yet this is not something you'll find in a textbook anywhere. And yet it is integral to our real history. I'd love to see some transparency one of these days, and perhaps the work that we do just being that voice. I mean, I know we're planting seeds, and perhaps in our lifetime we wouldn't see the fruits of that labor. But I mean, I really would wish to see a little bit of transparency when it comes to a project like this because of its far-reaching affect and the multitude of lives that it impacts. It'd be just very curious. It'd be a different paradigm that we live in with that type of information. And again, even if they didn't divulge everything to us, just gave us a sliver, it would be something so earth-shattering that, people would look at things a different way. I mean, how would you feel? Well, maybe not yourself because of your experiences, but for the layman, how would they feel if you walked to your neighbor tomorrow and said, hey, time travel's real and I can prove it? It's interesting to know,
My neighbors already think I'm crazy.
And that makes two of us, Penny. It'd be interesting to see if with that information, they used it correctly, and not for something in self-gain. I think that, those who sort of discovered and hacked upon all of this information empirically the way that they did in the projects, obviously their heart was not in the right place. They were looking towards, a certain future for that group of people rather than, the masses. And perhaps, as you mentioned here in so many words, believing that people were disposable and that life really didn't have any real value. That's the way they treated people in these projects, again, across the board.
Yeah, it was across the board. It's you perform or you'll be killed. And at least in my project, death wasn't even an option. They would bring you back from the dead and with full memory of them killing you. That wasn't something to enable you. That was something to enslave you. And so one of the biggest problems that I have coming forward talking about these things is the feeling that I don't have any say in my own life, that I've never had any say in my own life. That's the hard thing. And there have been plenty of times that I chose a particular path and rejected another one, and I would end up on the one that I rejected. So many times.
Interesting.
So many times that people would comment, we know you didn't want to do that. Why are you there? Because that one got shut down on me. It was just, I was funneled into this option, whether I wanted to be or not. And now I'm not going to say that it's necessarily the agency involved that did it, although I think that they did more times than not. But I'm to the point in my life, I don't have free will. I mean, I didn't choose the NSA agent to restore my memories. This wasn't something, the guy just popped up in my Facebook feed one day, and from that point on, it was like I was drawn like a magnet. So in my personal life, I know I've been involved with the CIA, the NSA, and the OSS. Who else? I don't know. I've only got memories from 32 altars. I don't know what the rest of the 2,000 were involved in. And yes, it was what Stuart Swerdlow describes as the 13 by 13 by 13 cubic hierarchical array. This was standard in the Black Ops in those days. Up until, I'd say, 1995. A lot of things changed in 1995. That was when they stopped leaning on remote viewing and went more with looking glass technology, so that it wasn't filtered through a mind anymore. That was when looking glass came online. So,
again, which is curious because, we often look to ourselves and say our body is our best instrument, or the psyche, has no limitations. I mean, from my understanding, the CIA abandoned, any type of remote viewing based on what Joe McMonagle had said, because it just wasn't as consistent, or, they would try to view somebody who was remote viewing them, in a militaristic fashion. And though they were able to, bring this into focus, this person might have been remote viewing them 2 years ago or 2 years in the future. There wasn't anything present. So as a result, they decided to sort of abandon that practice. I'd have to tell you that, even though there are many out there who are very clear vessels and filters for remote viewing, I've had some incredible results myself with this. And you know what? I do find a consistency. Perhaps it just goes person to person. I really don't know. But if you're using it in such a fashion that's regimented, you're putting a structure around something that essentially doesn't have a form. It's an intuitive endeavor. And yes, there's a process, but again, it's an intuitive approach. Perhaps that's what they came up against. And that was the wall that kept them from going forward. There are many instances of people, saying that they were going into a remote viewing session. Next thing you knew, they were astral projecting. Perhaps that was something that was more powerful. But again, we go back to this nonlinear aspect of, this type of work. And what you're viewing at that moment may not be what's there at this very present moment. And that's sort of probably the concerning thing that, again, I've come up against.
Well, I know that in 95, they switched it from people like us remote viewing to using the technology. Now, I'm not sure what their rationale was. It may have been too many minds that they couldn't control the loose lips. Security may have been the issue. But this was the time frame when a lot of things changed, was when they switched from remote viewers to looking glass. And about that same time frame was when they eased up a lot on the people they took. They weren't as punishing to mind fracture us. And when I was taken, we started off with 1,000 kids in 1959 at Langley. And by 1964, when we were shipped out, there were only 20 of us. They had killed everybody else. So I'm going to state that they probably were told that those losses were unacceptable.
Well, in any given percentage, especially in the military, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. To make something, in effect, usable within that sort of arena, you again have to have the consistency. If you start with 1,000 and you're left with 20, those aren't good numbers. You might as well just send people into war with a paper plate and a towel to slap each other. That's it's going to be a losing situation. But they did perfect some of this as time went on, and eventually they were able to let go of certain aspects and now have their own way of doing it. One of the biggest things that they learned from the Montauk project, which actually unfortunately sort of trickled down for a little while through the 90s, and I think even the early 2000s, if you're to look into it, was that this was all done by force. It took them a long time to, not necessarily that they didn't know and didn't learn from the Montauk project that was the wrong way to go, but it took them a long time to implement something else rather than doing things by force. Now, there's still a coercion in this type of activity. Don't get me wrong. It may seem more consensual, but then again, we're still learning about what people are going through today and how these projects are progressing along since that time.
Well, I talked to a lot of the younger people I'm in my 60s, and I'm talking to people that are in their 20s. And they're describing a gentler process, but it's just as mentally upsetting. So they're not going through exactly the same kinds of things that I remember going through, Um, Other countries, Australia especially, is a lot more gentle with their kids. I have a good friend in Australia that his kids go to what they're calling secret spy school, where they're being taken in their sleep, and they go to an astral school, and then they're returned by morning. So they're getting the same instruction. It's just not as physically debilitating. And it's taking place over a longer stretch of time, but they're staying with their family during it. So it's less harmful long term. I don't know if other countries are using that or not, but it would disturb me as a parent to have my kid at the breakfast table say, well, my teacher at secret spy school said such and such last night. Yeah.
I would say the very least.
Yeah. So,
well, that's curious that they're doing that, Again, I assume that there was some method employed, but I just wasn't sure exactly what they were doing. But if they're taking them at night and then returning them, so they're at least home during the day and, going to school during the day, whatever the case may be, living an ordinary life, it seems that, they've discovered something. No, I mean, when you look at other countries such as India, according to Dr. David Anderson, they have the most comprehensive time travel program in the world. But then you look over at Russia, you look at China, you mentioned Australia, of course. All of these countries have their own angles on how to approach the subject. And, I'm certain that although I don't think the chair itself is utilized today as much as it was, it may have been expounded on in way of technology. So it may be implemented in a different way. But when I look out, I don't see that specific chair that was in Montauk being used the same way. I feel like it's an archaic version of what we have today. But, with that in mind, I mean, India purportedly doesn't even send people into the past or the future anymore. They just send drones. And there are a multitude of reasons for this. One of those being, of course, it is safer. You're not suffering any casualties. I think eventually certain countries realize that if they take enough people, more likely there are going to be others that notice this is happening. And there's certainly the risk of some sort of divulgence with, their activity. But more importantly, it's just easier. They can throw a drone into a specific place. Let's say they're going to a battle in the Roman time. So, this thing's flying above. All these guys are down fighting below. Maybe one or two recognize it before they get the heads cut off. It really isn't impactful in the timeline that they're going back to. Even if somebody does see it, it's just like a UFO, perhaps like what we see today. And that brings up a whole other concept in respect to time travelers sending back or coming back in certain crafts. Obviously, in ufology, we've been considering this as a possibility for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. I've been following the ufology all along. I was, 10 years old when I started following ufology. I would state, if your child is really, really interested in UFOs, you might start to question why. But yeah. Yeah. So I was rather frustrated whenever that mainstream ufology decided that UFOs were all a consciousness thing, because some of them may be, but I know some of them are physical. I've got too many friends with marks from abductions that are pretty hard to pull off if it's strictly consciousness events.
Yeah, I don't think it's just strictly consciousness events. Mainstream media has a certain narrative that it follows, obviously based in fear and, claiming that these things are a threat, and anything associated with them is a threat. I think most of the time they're referring to something more worldly rather than otherworldly. But again, they're not going to admit it either way. At the very end of the day, they're only going to imply. Certainly, there has to be a physical aspect to this. I mean, there have been too many people who feel that they have been taken physically, have remembrances of looking at their body on a table, while in a ship with other individuals on a spacecraft somewhere. They have a very visceral recollection of that experience. And as you mentioned, they come back with certain marks. The fact of the matter remains that even if you are pulled in some way, shape, or form, wherein your body stays here in the third dimension, you still return in the third dimension. Somebody might ask, well, how is it possible that one can make marks on the body but not take the body along for the experience? Well, it's very similar to how, certain paranormal events happen when you come in contact with a negative or an aggressive spirit who then leaves marks on your body. There's a theory that the ions actually heat up around that spot. There's a concentration with the ions, and this is what creates that mark. So it is entirely possible, again, in theory, that some of these abduction cases that are rooted in dreams or other forms of consciousness that are sort of outside our general awareness, that they're experiencing this, but at the same time, whatever's being done to them, remember, the mind is the imprint of the physical, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever's being done to them, they're remembering it, but it's manifesting on the body as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that the body is lifted up. I mean, maybe that's happened. I do believe that that's happened in many cases, but I think that, certain species or whoever it is that's taking us in this way has become more privy to other ways to do this that are perhaps not necessarily gentle or more gentle for us, but just easier for them to kind of get through. Again, it's speculative, but again, it's another thought out there on the table.
Because of my personal experiences, I've come to believe that most of the sightings are actually Earth-based, that they are technology that we've kept secret. There are some that are not explainable that way, but I look at the photographs of TR3 series ships, and people are like, oh, I saw this, and I'm like, yeah, they make those in a plant in Utah.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Let's talk to Lockheed Martin. Let's talk to Skunkworks. Let's talk to these privatized organizations that have this reconnaissance back-engineered technology. The concerning thing to me is that none of these corporations have an obligation to report what they have either to the government or to us. There's no legal ramification that can be taken. So therefore, they've had all of this equipment for a very long time. They've had the time to back engineer it, and apparently have been quite successful in doing so. Mm-hmm. Now, in the same breath of the word, I've been told that it's my guess that about 90% of what we see in our skies is us driving this technology, but the other 10% comes about from other species. Maybe they're interplanetary, maybe they're outside of our system, but either way, they're here. But what happens is that, yes, there may be a biological component to their craft, but there's certainly a mechanical component as well. And the inhabitants or the pilots of this craft are usually working in some sort of harmony on a conscious level to drive this thing along. So what happens is that, even though these beings may seem somewhat celestial to us in certain fashions, whether it be the technology or the consciousness they embody, they're still fallible, just like us in their own way. So there might be a mistake in either the operator error. So, maybe there's a cloaking mechanism that goes around a certain craft and, somebody loses concentration, or there's a break in the loop that they're working with. Therefore, all of a sudden, whoop, you see this craft in the sky and somebody says, oh my God, they scramble. And next thing you know, whoop, flips back out. And you're like, what was that? That's one possibility. Also, they say that mechanical failures do happen. Nothing's perfect. And even in their scope of seeing things, they do have times of trial and error the same way that we do. I think many of these species have developed and evolved in a similar fashion, perhaps very far in their distant history. They were like us in a certain way. But on the same token, I've been told that this particular earthly experience is very unique because more often than not, you don't have a grouping of, let's just say for the sake of conversation, souls coming into a planet of such vast differing experiences from other places, even here on the earth. So you get this melting pot of people who are being here for the very first time. And you have people who have been here for thousands of lifetimes, intermixing and intermingling. I mean, we see a lot of conflict, I think, as a result of these different soul levels and, again, way of experience. And, again, perhaps the clashing over, human drama is rooted in some of this. But, again, it's a lot of conjecture, but at the same time, we have our experiences. And if we can't rely on anything else, we should be relying on our own personal experiences.
That makes sense. It was one of those download things where I was shown that Earth was a nursery for baby souls. And that's why we have why it's like a prison planet. Was to make it a nursery where these baby souls were protected while they figured out how to live in bodies. But that the rest of the galaxy figured out that because of the prison situation, that they could dump their criminals and their deposed rulers and all of those folks here too. And that we're all incarnating in the same basic physical forms now. So you can only tell each other apart by how you act. So you have absolute babies and you have everybody that nobody else wanted. And that we are all stuck here until we get to that magic 52% service to others. So
there's a lot of truth to that. There's an absolute truth to what you're saying there. Again, we're just here to scratch the surface. As significant as our experiences may be and the conveyance of such things, we're really laying that path. And I don't say it in any grandiose sense. I say it with absolute humility. It's what we're here to do. I'm a firm believer that we do sign some sort of contract or agreement prior to coming into an incarnation. We mold exactly the opportunities that we're going to have, the people that are in our lives and so forth. Maybe some of those interactions and experiences are for our own personal growth, but a lot of times they are for something much larger. And usually, if you look at it closely enough, it does come back to service to others. It's a very simple concept. And I think that people have been put off by this, for reasons of religious dogma and the way that has been enforced over, the millennia. We've certainly lost a large sense of who we are naturally, but I think we're just starting to remember to a certain degree, some of these more innate attributes that we do hold. I mean, indigenous cultures, by and large, have held on to this type of knowledge. And, it's been talked about many times that like organizations such as the Illuminati or, some of these behind the scenes organizations that have been holding on to certain information, even the Tibetan monks were certainly accused of holding on to certain esoteric information. But they did it because they knew that humanity's consciousness was taking a dive and that if the wrong hands would get some of this knowledge, it could be our demise. And I mean, there are people that will say, we have been doing this here on Earth. I think this is the 7th time around that we haven't destroyed ourselves yet. Thank God, right? We're hopefully going to make it.
We're starting the 5th round.
In way of vibration?
We're starting the 5th round in the way of rat races.
Okay.
Because the Hindus, the Greeks, and the Mayans all had the same count. So I wouldn't have gone by just one of them, but all three of them agreeing made it definitive to me, especially since they had been separated for so long. But we're starting the 5th cycle.
So it's an interesting ride, to say the least. And, for all of, for all of the,
an interesting ride when you've got all these people who believe you're only here for one trip. And you've got others who remember being here for more than one and can talk about the details. And they don't listen to each other at all, ever. So yeah, nope. It's like, doesn't matter what you can prove you experienced. It matters what your listener is able to absorb. And that was one of the biggest barriers for me, was understanding it was what they can absorb. And because my instinct is to just blurt out everything. And then people are going, eyes glazed over, mouths dropped open, they're drooling, and I'm like, uh-oh, I went too far.
Probably, I've seen those expressions before.
You've seen them, I can tell, yes. But yeah, yeah, you get into these topics and people are like, well, you probably have heard of Misha Johnston. I stayed at her house with friends for a week or so, a couple of years back. And Lou and I stayed a day or two after the others left. And I was sitting there going, was I really that bad? And she says, honey, you can go from normal to too deep in under 10 seconds. I'm like, oh.
You bet. Believe me, I've heard the complaint all too often. Not so much these days. I'm a little bit more discerning with who I share certain things with. But, when you have a certain truth, as we talked about here, and this is sort of the motif of the show tonight, it's about getting that voice out. And, once you start doing that, you got to talk to the right people. You'll be supported in that expression. And that's right now one of the best things that we can have.
Yeah, that's one of the most important parts of the healing process, bringing it back around to where you started it, is to be heard by people who are supportive, and to have it known that these things actually did happen. That's probably the most healing. The majority don't believe you. It's like, oh, right, Montauk. That's just. But
even if they don't believe you, they can still support you in their own way. And those are the people you want to surround yourself with. I mean, I don't blame anybody for not believing, what I'm saying right off the bat, as I'm sure you hold a similar conviction. But there are people that understand that we've gone through something, or something is happening, and we have something to talk about. Again, they may not understand it, but they'll honor that. They'll acknowledge it and validate it.
For me, it's not so much that they have to believe that I believe that it actually happened. It's to not be nasty about it when I talk about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You don't have to be rude. One of the most common comments on my YouTube is that I'm demon possessed. And in my opinion, that's just rude. If you don't like what I'm talking about, you don't have to listen. You can walk
That's it. It's that plain and simple.
So
we won't lose sleep over it, I promise.
No. Yeah. I've had probably, during the 5 years that I was doing counseling, I had probably 400 people, one after the other, several at a time, sometimes in small groups, sometimes separately, that no one had ever listened to their story, ever.
Mm-hmm.
And it was healing for them just to have me listen. Or actually, they would write it out in text and I would read it and make comments. And then they would send me some more. And because I have alters, it's best you text, because if you're talking to the wrong altar and I come back, then I have no idea what that altar told you.
Certainly.
I mean, that's my reality. I switch between personalities and they don't all share memory. So if you're talking to me like on the phone, I don't know what you said. You know, I will switch back to another personality and I may not be that person again for the next year. I have no idea what I told you.
You know, just to kind of parallel what you're saying there before I have to go, I want to let people know that, you know, there are many times that a person will go into a trance or a clairvoyant will begin to read you. And as they're channeling this in, you know, you're having this conversation seemingly with that person, although they're, you know, again, being that channel. When they come out of that space, when they remove themselves from that space and ground themselves back here, they may not have any idea what was discussed, no names, no experiences, they have no idea what just happened in respect to the content that was conversed about. This is a natural course. I mean, when you pull yourself out that far, you remove yourself. I've certainly experienced it myself, but I've seen others, again, who very adamantly do the work of reading people psychically, you know, clairvoyantly and so forth. They just have no recollection after the fact. I'm like, oh, cup of tea? Sure, absolutely. No idea what they've said.
I had to stop doing readings on people because a woman from DOD used that to try to kill me. She said, we want you to talk to this rogue agent. Everyone we've sent to her has been killed, blah, 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 blah. We, you know, appeal to my goodwill towards mankind, that I wouldn't want agents to be killed because they're people, you know. And she said, well, just talk to her, you know. And I said, well, I have to have a photo to make a connection. And so I connected with this person and found out that she had been told I was the rogue and that I needed to be killed. And it was a very difficult disconnection. And I've been terrified that that would happen again. So I don't read others anymore.
Sometimes it's the safest thing to do. And that approach is a necessary protection. That's just the way that it goes. And I completely understand that 100%.
Yeah. A lot of people don't. Well, if you can read me, why don't you? Well, because that was used to try to kill me before. And no, I don't know you. I'm not going to take that chance. And they're like, So.
Well, you know what? When you read somebody, you never know what you're going to see. You know, you never know what you're going to end up feeling. You never know what you're going to see through that mind's eye. You know, people have a lot within their energetic field. And
they do.
I mean, you look at the signature itself.
They have a lot more than they think. You can see the person, you can see alters, you can see everything that's attached to their aura, everything. If you're in the zone, you can see every person they've ever had sex with.
Yes, 100%. Yes.
And all their kids, all their family, everybody they've had a bad relationship with, you know. You can see that teacher that screamed at them when they were 5. You know, you can see all of that. And when you're demanding someone to read you, you're subjecting them to that. And that's a lot to ask of a total stranger. especially one you have no intention of giving money to. You know, people who are out there reading for money, they are saying they will deal with all that. But if you come to me as a total stranger and you're demanding I do this and you have no intention of even giving me money, that's just cold-blooded. You know what I mean?
It's about expectation versus energy exchange.
Yeah. Well, it's not just, I've had a lot of people do total expectation, hubris type expectations with no intention of energy exchange. And it's been frustrating. I have felt just as used by them as I was by the agencies, because let's face it, they don't pay you either.
No, that's for sure. That is absolutely for sure.
And so, you know, the public out there doesn't even think of it in those terms. We're back to they're completely service to self and they don't even realize it.
I couldn't agree with you more, Penny. But you know, unfortunately, my time has run for the evening. But I want to thank you wholeheartedly for having me on the show. I think you have a fantastic channel. What you do is certainly important and significant, not only in regards to the fields that we traverse, but to get this out to the general public. So I want to thank you and your audience for taking the time to, you know, talk with me. And I'm absolutely honored, and it was my pleasure to be here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. And I checked out your channel, and it's really good. His shows are about an hour, give or take a little. So if you don't have the 2 hours for my show, check out his. And
That's very nice of you. Thank you.
Do you have anywhere besides your YouTube that you want to share with the public how to contact you?
If anybody's interested in contacting me directly, you can reach me at DarkHourParanormalLive@gmail.com. You can also catch me on Third Phase of Moon. You can catch me on Third Phase UFO Report and occasionally on GoofOn over on YouTube. In the meantime, as Penny said, I do run Dark Hour Paranormal. Please come on over. We have some very enticing and interesting interviews with high caliber folks along with common experiencers alike, including documentaries, mini documentaries and full documentaries that I upload periodically based on certain locations, whether it be legends or urban mystery or paranormal investigations. I stray away from the actual mechanics of investigation these days, perhaps a story for another show. But long story short, anybody who goes over there, I have a good feeling you will enjoy the content we provide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been enjoying it. So
thank you so much, Penny.
Thank you for coming.